Okay, thank you. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our 19th talk, Marmara University Philosophy Department. Today, our speaker is Anders Herlitz. Anders is an associate professor at the of practical philosophy at Lund University. And he's also a researcher at the Institute for Future Studies. His main research areas are distributive theory, value theory, and population-level bioethics. We can just get to it directly. Anders, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me. So today, I think I sent out a slightly different title to you guys. I might have called it stakes in the title I showed you, but I'm going to talk about what I refer to as fixing claims in distributive theory. So fixing, that's why I call it stakes in some titles. So fixing what matters to an individual in distributive theory is what it's going to be about. Sometimes it's framed in terms of complaints. Individuals have complaints against certain distributions. Sometimes it's framed in terms of claims. People have claims to certain benefits in certain distributions. I sometimes play around with using the neutral term stakes to capture both of these. In this talk, I'm going to stick to the sort of claims terminology because it's perhaps more closely related to the theories I'm going to invoke here. So, wait, I need to, yeah. So some words of background just before I get into it. So I've been for a long time interested in a theory that's called the priority view or prioritarianism, which essentially says that benefiting people matters more the worse off these people are. So you can sometimes think of it that, you know, you should try to maximize the amount of benefits, but you should add to that idea the idea that you should weight benefits more when they go to people who are worse off. And this is a theory that was first formulated by Derek Parfit and then it's been picked up by many people. So when you see a formulation of a view like this, as in the quote on the slide here, benefiting people matters more, the worse of these people are, there are a couple of questions that present themselves immediately, which I've taken an interest in. So one question concerns time. So do we care about how well off people are over their whole lives? Do we care about how well off they are at the time when we make the decision of how to distribute our resources? Or should we care about how well off they are when they receive the resources and so forth? A different question, which this talk is going to be much more about, is in what, so to speak, world we are looking at when we determine how well off people are. Is it the actual world that we care about, how well off they are in that world? Or is it the world in which they have received the benefits that we can create through our decision? Now, in relation, so this is what I'm primarily going to talk about in this talk. And in relation to the theory prioritarianism, I've already done some published work on this together with a co-worker, Neri Yao, who you can see a picture of here. And we basically identified two different ways of interpreting prioritarianism. So we on the one hand identified what we call the input version, which says that benefiting people matters more the worse of these people are if there is no distribution taking place. And on the other hand, an output version, which says that in any distribution, benefiting people matters more the worse of these people are in that distribution. And in this paper that we wrote together, we illustrate that these two interpretations actually can generate different recommendations in different circumstances. So there are two genuinely different positions you can take. But while doing this work, I I also realized that our little distinction when it came to prioritarianism, on the one hand, is far from exhaustive. You know, there are many other versions that we did not go into in this space. But the distinction, or the type of distinction that we were doing, also generalizes to many other distributive theoretical approaches, and in particular approaches that are in some sense person-centered, that tries to ascribe importance to individuals and individuals' claims. And these theories are typically formulated by invocations of concepts such as claims or complaints. So that's sort of how I came to frame this in terms of claims as well. So the current research process that I'm pursuing tries to ask this question: what the plausible framework for a claims-based distributive theory looks like. And it has three different parts, but the one part I'm going to talk about today is this first question of how these claims should be fixed in this sense that I tried to illustrate with prioritarianism. I hope to be able to make it clearer what I mean in a minute. So claim-based distributive theoretical views come with a whole lot of different kinds of substance. So you can see desertarian theories, so theories that think that we should distribute resources based on merit or desert, are often formulated in terms of claims. So desert claims are the basis for distributive judgments. Prioritarianism is sometimes, but definitely not always, formulated in terms of claims. So people have stronger claims to receive some benefit the worse of these people are. Sufficientarianism, in its, I think, first formulation by Harry Frankfurt, introduces the word claim when he says it's possible for those who are worse off not to have more urgent needs or claims than those who are better off, because it's possible for them to have no urgent needs or claims at all. In the contractualist tradition, it's perhaps less common to talk about claims, but it's certainly extremely common to think about how to evaluate distributions in terms of the complaints that people can charge against them or against the principle that would justify them. And there might also be sort of more foundational theoretical reasons to think about distributions in terms of claims. So those impressed or inspired by Steve Darvall's idea of second personal ethics, according to which the very basis of ethics is the second personal relations that we have to each other. If you come to ethics with that kind of perspective, it might become very natural for you to speak in terms of individual claims and the claims that they can pose on distributors. It's been suggesting that the sort of claims framework is a way of taking separateness of persons seriously. A very sort of indirect reason, I'm not going to go too much into this, but for those of you who might have encountered it before, invoking claims have been suggested as a way of avoiding the so-called leveling down objection against egalitarianism. So leveling down objection is basically the idea that it's absurd to think that you can make an outcome better just by making some people worse off. But there's also perhaps some sort of historical explanation for why people talk in terms of claims that can be traced back to sort of Hofeldian framework of rights. And before illustrating what I mean more precisely with this idea of fixing claims, it might be helpful to see in more detail one specific substantive proposal of how we should distribute resources, which is extremely explicitly presented in terms of claims. So Alex Voorhoeven's aggregate relevant claims view, which I'm later going to come back to make some illustrations as well. So his theory of how we ought to distribute resources says that each individual whose well-being is at stake has a claim on you to be helped. These individuals' claims are going to compete with each other in case they can't all be satisfied. A person's claim is going to be stronger the more she can be helped, so the more benefits we can give to her, and also the lower the level of well-being from which this increase would take place. A claim is relevant, he says, if and only if it's sufficiently strong relative to the strongest competing claim. And finally, he suggests that we should choose the alternative that satisfies the greatest sum of strength-weighted relevant claims. I hope this is not going too fast, but I'm going to get back to illustrations of how this is going to work as well. Okay, so how are these claims supposed to work when we look at more specific sort of cases? I think it's illustrative to start off with a very famous case from discussions about the value of equality, which is from a famous article by Thomas Nagel. So he writes, and all of this is a quote: "Suppose I have two children, one of which is normal and quite happy, and the other of which suffers from a painful handicap. Call them respectively the first child and the second child. I'm about to change jobs. Suppose I must decide between moving to an expensive city where the second child can receive special medical treatment and schooling, but where the family's standard of living will be lower and the neighborhood will be unpleasant and dangerous for the first child, or else moving to a pleasant semi-rural suburb where the first child, who has a special interest in sports and nature, can have a free and agreeable life." So this is a situation that he presents where there's only two individuals who he thinks are relevantly affected by the choice, the two kids. One of the kids is going to benefit from one of the choices, the other kid is going to benefit from the other choice, and they are differently well off, right, to begin with, and also after the choice has been made. And this is the kind of situation that we want these kinds of distributive theories to be able to help us determine what to do. Now, to simplify the illustration, at least to me, this is a simplification, I'm going to present these kinds of distributive cases in a highly simplified way using numbers. So here, keeping Nagel's story in the back of my mind, or in back of mind, I think that these kinds of distributive choices can be represented like this. So the initial situation that Nagel describes, where there's two children, one of which is what, as he called, normal and quite happy. I think that might be politically incorrect to call a handicapped child not normal these days, but we can set that aside. And the other that suffers from a painful handicap, we can describe this as a pair of numbers, right? So we have the worse off kid, we describe that person's well-being or how well off that person is with the number 3. The better off child, we describe their person's well-being or how well off they are with the number 7. The numbers are not very important here. What matters is the relation between the numbers. One is better, higher than the other, right? And this is the initial situation before we change job in Nagel's case. There are two choices. I call them here A and B. A is supposed to represent a move to the city, which is better for the worse off child, so the first number in these pairs. We bring that one from 3 to 10. In my presentation, any move is good for the second kid, so the second kid gets from 7 to 11. We could also move to the suburb, which is also going to be a small improvement for the handicapped child, but it's going to be much better for the non-handicapped child. So we have a bigger difference between between the two numbers in B. So this is just a way of representing these kinds of choices, right? Now, pretty much all distributive theories are going to tell you that it's better to move to the city, at least if the total sum of well-being is what I've described here. There's 10 plus 11 is the same as 7 plus 14, so there's no loss of well-being if you move to the city. It's just slight, you just reduce inequality. You make the outcome more equal that way. So the question that I'm interested in now is not really what choice should be made. It's rather how we get to the conclusion that it's better to move to the city than to move to the suburb. And I think there are 3 different ways in which a claim-based theory, like Alex Vorhover's theory, can actually get you to the conclusion that we should move to the city rather than to the suburb. So the first kind of way of thinking is what I'm referring to here as the baseline view. The baseline view says that an individual's claim to an option is determined by comparing the individual's circumstances in that option and their circumstances such as they are if we don't do anything at all. This seems to be a very natural reading of the sort of texts that present these theories. So when Parfit says that people have stronger claims to receive some benefit, the worse of these people are, he seems to refer to some kind of baseline, right? If the baseline that consists of doing nothing. And similarly, in Vorhover's formulation, when he says that an individual's claim is stronger, the more her well-being would be increased by being aided, and the lower the well-being from which this increase would take place. He also seems to refer to some kind of baseline. And we can also find sort of support for this way of thinking if we go beyond philosophy and look at certain theories in health economics, which are much more clear about this actually, because they're forced to operationalize their views in more detail. So we find this suggestion by health economist Eric Nord, that if the proposition of his theory is true, it's possible to encapsulate it in numerical valuation models by multiplying utility gains in the conventional quality-adjusted life year model by weights that reflect the severity of the start point. So again, he's referring to some kind of start point or baseline. And I think that there could be some sort of theoretical underlying justifications for accepting this baseline view as well. I think an argument can be made for how caring about these circumstances, if nothing is done, might reflect the empathy of an impartial observer, if you want to use that kind of tool to explore what kind of distributions are good. There could also be some reason to expect this view because it might avoid certain issues in population ethics, or certain issues when we discuss cases where we change the number of people that exist, because clearly this kind of view has a bias towards people who exist if nothing is done. But it's not the only way of thinking, right? So a second way of fixing claims for these theories is what I call the binary view, according to which an individual's claim to an option, when two options are compared, is determined by comparing how well off the individual is in these two options. So basically the idea is that you make pairwise comparisons of all options and you think of claims as something individuals have between the two options in each pairwise comparison, you establish pairwise comparisons of all options, and then you, based on that, you then formulate a ranking of all your options. This, to me, this is a sort of peculiar reading of the literature that doesn't seem to be what they're talking about when they formulate their theories. But it is a sort of a way of thinking that has strong support in the more choice theoretical tradition, which very often sort of takes as its point of departure pairwise comparisons of options. And a final view, which I think also is less straightforward as a reading of the literature, but again has support in a more choice theoretical tradition, is what I call the global view. So the idea that an individual's claim to an option is determined by comparing how well off the individual is in that option and how well off she is in all the other options. So when I look at how strong a claim is to a specific option, I take into account all the information in all the other options that I have available. So to go back to Nagel's case, these three views are going to function in the following way. So the baseline view is going to say, is going to provide special privilege to the status quo situation. So the information or the circumstances before any choice is made. And it's going to use that information to evaluate the options A and B. So the idea is that it's going to look at how much we can benefit the first person in A, and then weight that with information from status quo, and do the same for the second person, and then treat option B the same way. And it's going to recommend A because the first person is much worse off in the status quo. So those benefits are going to be weighted higher. The binary view in this case is not going to provide any privilege to any of these three positions. It's merely going to compare options A and B to each other, because we only have two options in this case. And it's going to recognize that from B to A, the first individual goes from 7 to 10, and from A to B, the second individual goes from 11 to 14. So each of them is going to get 3, but going from 7 to 10 will be weighted with a higher weight than going from 11 to 14. So that's why it's also going to recommend A here. And the global view, I think it's going to be more clearer in a couple of minutes what that's how that's going to work. But in this simple case, the global view is going to collapse into the binary view because we only have two options. So all options are going to be the same as the two options, right? So and for the exact same reasons, it's going to say that A is better than B. So those are three different ways of sort of reaching the exact same conclusion, which is perhaps not very interesting. What's going to be more interesting, I hope, is that these three different ways of thinking about or fixing claims are in other cases going to recommend different and contradictory recommendations. And to illustrate this, I'm going to rely again on on Alex Warhover's view here. So just to rehash it quickly, the idea is that we should aggregate or add up strength-weighted claims, but we should only care about claims that are strong enough relative to the strongest competing claim. So, for instance, and this is the background, so why he developed this theory, if you can save a life, if one person has a claim to getting their life saved, another person has a claim to getting their headache alleviated, the claim to get your headache alleviated is not relevant. So according to this theory, those very small claims should not be added up or taken into account at all once there are very, very significant claims, such as life-saving things at the table. So that's sort of the general idea here. We sum up the benefits that we can generate, and we weight them with how badly off the beneficiaries are, but we exclude this tiny benefits that we can give to people. Okay, so I'm not going to give you any story about this when I make this illustration. I hope you can follow just the numbers here. The idea is again very similar to this case of Thomas Nagel. We have two individuals that are affected by our choice. In the status quo situation, the first one is worse off than the other. We have two options that make both of them better off. We have a third option which makes the first person better off and the second person worse off. So what are our three different ways of fixing claims together with Warhover's theory going to tell you about this kind of case? So the baseline view is going to rank the options in the following way. It's going to say that B is better than A, which is better than C. So B and A are just transmutations of each other, as you can see. One is at level 8, the other is at level 9. But because the baseline view ascribes some kind of privilege to the status quo situation, it's not going to treat those options as equally good. So it's going to say that the option that's best for the person who's worse off in status quo is better than the other. And in this case, that happens to be B. So in B, we can bring the first person to 9 and the second to 8, whereas in A, we'll bring the first person to 8, the second to B. But because the first person is worse off initially in the status quo, the view is going to say that B is better than A. And C is going to be worse than both of these options for, I hope, pretty obvious reasons. It contains less well-being, and it's more inequality. It's just not a very good option. So the baseline view will tell you that B is better than A, which is better than C. The binary view is going to first compare A and B to each other. When A and B are compared to each other, there's a claim, the first person has a claim to 1 to go from 8 to 9. So he has a claim to B. The second person has a claim to A, which is going to be exactly as strong because he's also going to go from 8 to 9. So those options will be precisely equally as good. And again, C is going to be worse than both of them, right? So the binary view will say A and B equally good, both better than C. And the global view, finally, is going to give you yet another result, namely that A is better than B, which is better than C. And the reason is that although C is worse than both A and B on all these views, the information present in C, the fact that the second person is much worse off, is going to influence how A and B are ranked to each other for very similar reasons to why the baseline view said that B is better than A. The global view will say that A is better than B. So instead of caring about the first person being at level 5 in status quo, like the baseline view did, the global view will care about the fact that the second person is on level 4 in option C, and have that influence sort of the ranking of these options. So we have now one sort of substantive theory, this aggregate relevant claims view. And we have 3 different ways of interpreting how to fix claims, as I've called it. And we get 3 different and contradictory recommendations or suggestions of how we should rank options in this very abstract and artificial case, but I think not necessarily very unrealistic. There's gonna be a lot of real world cases with this kind of structure, I think. And this is not a very, I don't know, if one is interested in theoretical puzzles, I guess this is an interesting result. Otherwise, I think it's a pretty troubling result for a theory to leave us with this sort of unsettled result. But I also think things sort of get worse, because I think there are problems with each of these 3 different views of how to fix claims, and which is what I'm going to move over to now, and you might even have started thinking about them already. So let's start with some problems with the baseline view. So I suggested that the baseline view will say that B is better than A, which is better than C in this case that I've been discussing. And the reason is that B is better for the worst of person in the status quo. Okay. Imagine now that you make the choice, right? You choose B. So when you choose B, you are creating that world, as so to speak, as the status quo. So then when you made your choice, then that's going to be the sort of nothing happens world. But then when that choice is made, that's going to affect what the theory says about how the options should be ranked. So now all of a sudden, A is better than B, better than C. Because A is better for the worst of person after we've chosen B. So then the theory will tell you, if you have the opportunity to change your mind and choose A rather than B. But of course, if you choose A and make that your status quo, for the same reasons, B is then going to be better than A. So basically, the theory is going to suggest that you ought to run around in some kind of circle if you have that kind of opportunity. And I mean, I'm not going to go into any details about this, but it would also presumably tell you that it would be acceptable to take on a small cost to change from A to B, which means that you're exposed to some kind of money pump argument if that's kind of circumstances can be generated. And more formally speaking, I might suggest that the baseline view violates a condition which has been called normative invariance. The idea that an action's normative status doesn't depend on whether or not it's performed. It seems that the baseline view, that in some circumstances, the normative status of a choice, according to the baseline view, can very much depend on whether it's been performed or not, as we saw in this illustration where we run around in circles, right? And I think there's at least questions to be raised concerning a different condition, which has been called satisfiability. So the idea that for any agent in any possible situation, there's an action such that if the agent were to perform the action in this situation, she would conform to the theory. So have we really conformed to a theory if the theory tells you after the fact that you should have chosen something you did not choose? Again, as in this case where we run around in a circle. Once I've chosen B here, the theory will tell me I should have chosen A. So have I really conformed to the theory then? I'm not sure. The binary view leads to what might seem like worse issues. So the binary view, straightforward, can lead to cyclical rankings. So in this, here is, in order to show this, I need a different example. So here's just 3 different outcomes with distributions 1, 9, 10. Who gets what is different in the 3 distributions. If we follow Voorhover's view that we should only care about relevant claims, and we think that going from 9 to 10 is not going to be relevant when you can go from 1 to 10 or 1 to 9, this theory is going to say that B is better than A, which is better than C, which is better than B. And the reason is that when you compare B and A, you look at how the first person can go from 1 to 10 if you choose B. The third person can go from 1 to 9 if you chose A. The second person is irrelevant by the substantive stipulation of the theory. So B is going to be better than A because 1 to 10 is better than 1 to 9. And the exact same is going to happen when you compare A and C and then C and B. So the binary view, at least when paired with Alex Voorhover's theory, can just provide you with cyclical rankings of your options. The global view finally violates a different kind of formal condition. So remember when we talked about this case where we had 3 options, A and B, which were just transmutations of each other, and then an option C, which was worse for both, but significantly worse for the second person. I suggested that the global view ranks them A better than B better than C. Interestingly, if C was not an option at all, the global view would say that A and B are equally good. So although everyone is worse off if C is chosen, and no serious distributive theories suggest that one ought to choose C, it has significant implications for how to rank the, so to speak, serious contenders, right? And this shows that the global view violates what's been called expansion consistency, which says that it's if two options X and Y are best in a set of alternatives, both options have to be best in a superset in which either is best. So to go back here, in the lower set where we only have A and B, both are best. ABC is a superset of AB. We just added C, right? And A is best in ABC, but B is not. So we have a violation of expansion consistency. A and B are best in the smaller set, but only A is best in the expansion of this set, or in the superset of it. Okay, so what are we supposed to do with this mess, so to speak? So I think there's a couple of different ways of dealing with this. One, of course, is just to bite the bullet, so to speak, and accept peculiar results in some circumstances. But are we really willing to give up on rationality requirements in the context of normative principles? I think this is, it's actually a genuine question, although it might seem rhetoric to me. I think that people who are coming to sort of claim-based theories might really be willing to say that these kinds of rationality requirements that I've invoked in the very last part of this talk have very limited importance for sort of questions about normative principles, that it's just two different sort of intellectual areas, and we shouldn't care so much about these requirements. I personally don't have that opinion, but I think some people might actually. Alternatively, we could tinker with the content of the normative view to avoid the problems. So I don't know if you noticed or thought about it when I suggested the argument, but when I illustrated that the binary view can lead to cyclical rankings, a necessary part of that argument or illustration was that not all claims are relevant in all circumstances. You might, I think, be able to avoid cyclical rankings if you dismiss the idea that only relevant claims should be aggregated or summed up together. So in essence, you can change. I mean, I'm talking about a pretty formal question here concerning how to fix claims and problems with them. Some of these formal problems can be avoided, I think, by changing the substantive nature of your distributive theory. But I'm not sure that that's in line with the underlying sort of motivation for caring about claims in the first place. So what comes first? Should we care about these formal conditions before we care about the substantive motivations for why we care about this, or the other way around? And I think it might be more natural actually to think about the substantive issues first and the formal issues second. Thirdly, we might be able to look for some kind of principled way of excluding certain options from consideration and use the global view. So in this example I used, this option C is just worse for everyone, why does it even enter the sort of table? Why do we care about it in the first place? We might be able to have some formal or some principled way of saying that, well, you should only care about serious contenders or something like that. But I think it's easier said than done to come up with sort of clear and principled ways of actually excluding certain outcomes. So I think, although some work has been done on this in population ethics, I think it's very hard to come up with clear principles like this. And finally, we could fix claims within outcomes and make them merely reflect welfare levels or well-being levels in the outcomes. So not have them play the role to allow us to use information to compare different outcomes and have them sort of be targeted from one outcome to the next, but rather just have them operate within the isolated outcomes. But people have claims to something. A claim is something that's directed, right? And unless we're egalitarians or sufficientarians, it's very hard to see what the claim can be sort of targeted towards if it's only something that exists within an individual outcome. So for an egalitarian, a claim within an outcome can be a claim, well, Karim is worse off than I am in this outcome. So I might have a claim to get to his level. Or for a sufficientarian, everyone should be at a certain level. Within an outcome, I can have a claim to be at that level. But for all these other theories, like Voorhover's theory or prioritarianism, or these contractualist people, they don't have that kind of target that they can operate within outcomes. So it's very, very hard to understand why we should talk about claims at all if we only care about what happens in outcomes. And with that sort of pessimistic note, I'm done.
Thank you. We don't need pessimism here.
Maybe it's not so pessimistic. It's maybe just skeptical of why are we talking about claims to begin with? Maybe there's just other better ways of talking.
Okay, I do have some questions, but I will maybe
Should I stop sharing the screen, or
maybe we might need to
okay,
some of the slides because there are numbers and
but
as you wish.
I'll leave it.
So, okay, do you need a break, Anders?
No, I'm okay.
Okay, so the floor now is open for questions, if any has. Okay, Sina Moja.
I cannot find the hands. Just first of all, thank you very much for the talk. And I have a brief question about the normative invariance principle. So you mentioned that according to the baseline view, we run in circles. And I think it was after that, the normative status doesn't depend on whether or not it is performed. So if the normative invariance principle is not to be violated, then I guess, for instance, if B was chosen and the status quo became B, it would still be better than A? Is that the idea? If the normative invariance principle is not to be violated.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so that was my initial clarification.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. But I think also, I mean, there's a lot to say, I think, about this specific case, in that, so a lot of people who write about distributive theory don't write about these kinds of cases where, you know, you have two options that are just transmutations of each other, and then you have a third option. Because most people, I think, on the one hand, well, so most people will feel an intuitive pull towards the idea that A and B have to be equally good. You know, they're just, if we accept impartiality, that it doesn't matter, you know, who the personal identity of people and so on, they're just reflections of each other, so they have to be equally good. So I think that the idea that one of them is better than the other is strange to begin with, at an intuitive level. And then, but then what happens is that these theories, I think, can be understood as suggesting that one is better than the other, although it sort of hasn't been much recognized in the literature, because people don't pay attention to cases like this.
Okay. Well, I mean, initially, the reason why B is better is because of the principle of, you know, the worse.
Yeah.
It's for the person that is worse off.
Yeah.
It's initially the reason why B is better. My related question to this is, why is it significant that we run around in circles? I couldn't really understand. I may, of course, not, probably I'm missing something, but to me, it seems once the better choice is, let's say it's B, and then A becomes the better choice. When you choose A, B becomes the better choice. Why should that be significant? I don't understand why the fact that we run around in circles is significant, because at the end of the day, you are comparing the better choice in one set, and whatever is better is better. And then that's done. And then you start another set, which should be evaluated within itself. So I didn't see the problem of running around in circles, because the only way it becomes a problem is if you look at the whole as a chain. Okay, so this was better here, and now it's better, this one's better, and now, but they should be treated or thought about separately, shouldn't they?
Good. Yeah, so I mean, so according to the view, I think this is in line with what you were saying now too. Technically speaking, the options should be individuated differently depending on the circumstances or the set, right? So once you've, I mean, so we start here, status quo, we choose between A, B, and C. Once you've chosen B, you shouldn't talk about A, B, and C any longer. You should talk about A star, B star, C star, maybe. And then, you know, then A star is going to be better than B star. And then you get to, you know, once you choose A star, B star star is going to be better than A. I mean, and so you go, right? So which means that you don't have sort of at the very formal level, you don't have violations of certain rationality requirements. I think it's still a very peculiar result, but I mean, maybe we have different intuitions about this, or so. I think I'm so this kind of argument was part of the paper that I mentioned in the very beginning of the talk too, when we discussed this input prioritarian view. And I think so Near, my coworker, has worked a lot in bioethics, and he came up with situations like, okay, so we decide to give patient A treatment before patient B, and then, you know, I make this decision and I send the decision down to the ward or whatever, and then the ward looks at my decision and says, but no, patient B is actually the one who should get treatment because you recommended patient A. Then they send it down to the physician, and then they switch the decision again. I mean, you can see these kinds of sort of very applied or practical cases where it just seems very strange to have this, in a sense, instability going on in what the theory suggests. But maybe this isn't, you know, maybe people are willing to live with that and think that that's actually not the big problem. I'm open to that possibility. It's not a feature I want in my favored theory, but I'm trying to speak also to people with other opinions. So, and maybe some people are willing to accept this, you know.
Thank you.
I want to jump in because I have a question directly as a follow-up. I mean, so I have a question similar to Sinam Hoja's question, and I thought that maybe just like, for example, you suggested a solution for adopting the global view by introducing some principled way of excluding, let's say, cases C, the worst, you know. Why not introduce a time constraint on the baseline view that can allow us to get around the cyclicality? And the time constraint is something like some distance between A and A star, i.e. at T1, we have a certain ranking, B better than A better than C, okay? Based on T1 view, we make a choice. B is better. We act upon the choice, and then there is a time that has to pass such that the status quo is, let's say, sufficiently different. Only then another set of comparison can be introduced. And by then, by T2, let's say after a couple of months, because in real life, I mean, if you make a policy or you distribute, if you have organs, you're distributing, maybe at T1 you had 10 donors and 50 recipients. At T2 you have only 3 donors and 60, you know, things change. I mean, many variables change. And so we separate the sets by time, because in effect, I mean, yes, this is a formal theory, and we need a formal, let's say, requirements of rationality. But the actual problem on the formal level of rationality might simply disappear when it is actually at work, which is a counter. Let's think of it as if your co-author had, let's say, this case of sending the order from the, I don't know, HR to the post office. By the time it gets to the doctor, it changes 3 times. In some sense, this is real life, but also in real life, you have the other kind of cases that eliminates the cyclicality, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know if this makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think it does make sense. I think it's there are different ways of sort of thinking about it. I think so one way of thinking about it is that, well, these distributive theories are they're one among many things that matter for these kinds of choices. Consistency and, you know, transparency maybe of organizations, those kinds of things are also very important. And for those reasons, you know, you shouldn't change your mind. I mean, there might be some extra value to just being consistent in your choice and so on. And another sort of, I'm curious whether this would have had sort of a stronger pull on you. So another type of sort of point you can make with the baseline view and about these kinds of cases would be I mean, you change this, right? So if B is really better than A when they were just transmutations of each other, presumably B is going to be better than A also when you take away some of the benefits that you can distribute, right? And then that might, but I mean, that's not a formal argument, but it's more of a substantive argument that the baseline view would actually accept a loss in the amount of benefits you can create merely for reasons of what happens if nothing at all is done. Which, I mean, again, people might have different views about this, but we were suggesting that this was sort of not great, right?
Mm. I mean, there is a cost, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, any of the theories will, when it's actually put in practice, there will be a cost because action is going to be required, and so time is going to be spent. I don't know, things like this. I mean, intuitively speaking, it seems to me the baseline, for some reason, it seems very intuitive to me because I think the status quo is like the natural place we take into consideration. I mean, if this is where we are now, and this is why we are even asking these questions, because we think 5, for example, is too low, or we think that 5, the difference between 5 and 7 is too much in inequality. So we want to do something, and then we ask ourselves, what can we do? And we realize we have A, B, and C. These are the 3 possibilities we can move towards. And we say, okay, well, B seems to be the most, it wins. And so we'll act upon B. And then time passes, and then we might need to reassess and say, okay, now we are in a different status quo altogether, which makes me think, to what extent is the baseline view different from Rawls's maximin principle? You know, maximize the minimum.
Because I did so much scholarly work for that other article. So in that other article, the baseline, what I call the baseline view here, it's what we call the input view in that paper. And I dug up in Parfit's Reasons and Persons, which I'm sure you're familiar with. What you might be less familiar with is that book has a couple of appendices to it, some of which are written by other people. John Broome wrote an appendix to that book, which is published in the book, where he actually suggests that Rawls might have this kind of view in mind. And I think Rawls actually responds to Broome in, is it political liberalism? Or no, maybe not, maybe the restatement, whatever it is.
Justice as fairness, maybe restated.
Yeah, maybe it's in Justice as Fairness. He responds to this little remark in very sort of arrogant terms, if I can say so myself. and dismisses Broom as just completely misunderstanding him. So I don't think that this is what Rawls had in mind, but it's certainly one way of reading Rawls. I mean, so I think that this is, I mean, as I said in the beginning, I think this kind of question that I've been talking about is relevant to a lot of theories, but rarely discussed or even recognized as having importance. I mean, so what I try to do here is just to show how these kinds of questions actually matter, right? Because sometimes the theory will just say different things depending on how you think about them. Yeah. Okay. But it's, and I also, if I can say, it's as a matter of curiosity, I thought it was interesting that you thought that it was so natural to think in terms of the baseline view. So when we published that other paper, we discovered, or we encountered a phenomenon that I've never encountered before when it came to review reports. So we would get review reports where one reviewer would say, what are you doing? It's obvious that this theory should be understood in this way. And the other reviewer would say it's obvious it should be understood in the other way. And these were presumed, I mean, they were anonymous, but they were presumably experts on the theories, and they clearly disagreed with each other without even knowing it, right? And we could see it in the review reports, but yeah. So it was, yeah, interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's an indication that it is important, because if we clash on basic intuition, it means there's a lot of work to be done. And I mean, my guess, I would say, is it has a lot to do with what is your conception of the relationship between theory and practice generally. Because if your conception is, if you're very theoretical, and this is the formal view, let's say, those who are interested in just the formal theory, they will think this idea of baseline is not really helpful. Right? Because it just violates certain requirements of rationality that we are sure of and we are happy with and we want to preserve, and the theory violates it. End of the story, obviously. Versus someone who's saying, no, actually, practice comes first, and it's only from a particular life situation that you ask these questions. So, of course, the status quo, this is the situation we have. We can improve, and we want to choose what is the best way to improve, given that we are here. Yeah, I mean, and this is at least
I think you're perfectly right, and I mean, I encounter this. I mean, so there's certainly different ways of approaching distributive theory, as you point out, and some of them, they just start off with like axioms. So, you know, well, Pareto criteria, we need to start with those. And then impartiality, of course, is a basic criteria. And if you accept impartiality, you have to throw out the baseline view, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Some methodological, I mean, interesting questions. But let me just, sorry, I spoke too much, but are there any further questions? Anyone
I have a question.
Yes, please, Ishaq Hoja.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Anders, for this valuable presentation. My question is more about the nature of person-based distribution theory. As far as I understand truly, person-based distributive claims violate because requirements of rationality, in my opinion, they are sentimental rather than rational. Probably they inherently contain some features, and features that cannot be examined in terms of rationality. And therefore, probably the difficulty stems from the very concept of fixation, as you point out at the beginning of this presentation. If it is the case, is it possible to find more suitable concept rather than, for instance, person or fixing? The relevant question is, if an ideal stake-based distribution method cannot be fixed in terms of rationality, is it possible to create multiple samples and suggest some statistical solutions similar to, for instance, atomic theory or chemistry, rather than ethics.
I'm not sure what the suggestion is. So is the idea that you have that you accept, like, that there's a set of options that will be sort of maybe contradictory but still supported by the theory, and then in order to choose between these, you're going to use some statistical method. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, because in atomic theory, for instance, we cannot examine an individual atoms or structure in oneself, and it can multiply more and more. We can create a set of atoms or structure, and then is it possible to make some statistical solutions? That was my...
Yeah, I mean, I feel this is beyond my... I'm intrigued by your suggestion, but I'm not sure I have anything intelligent to say before I see the sort of, or before I understand the nature of these statistical methods, and how, I mean, I don't know how much about atoms and how they work there, but so can you give me a more concrete example, maybe?
Well, I mean, there is no concrete or suitable example in my mind, but as far as I understand, it is not possible to make any solution within the limits of rationality in terms of stake-based claims. Yeah. That was my point. If it is the case, probably we can find similar solutions in other fields.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I wonder if this is in line with what you're saying, at least. So in the written up version of this, I have a brief discussion in relation to acyclicity or cyclical rankings. So there have been some work in social choice theory that drops the sort of acyclicity requirement and develops choice methods for choosing when you have cyclical rankings. So the idea, I mean, so I think a common idea is that if you have a cycle, it's impossible to make a rational choice, because whatever you choose is going to be worse than some alternative, right? That idea, I think, it's too hasty, because there are other conceptions of what a rational choice is than the idea that you should choose something that's not worse than anything else. And that's been developed in this social choice theory tradition. So you can look at I think they might call it uncovered options. I mean, they have different other kinds of criteria can be used to justify a choice, also when you have cycles. That's the basic idea. And I wonder if you're suggesting something similar. So even if your theory is going to spit out what looks at first as big problems because they violate rationality requirements, you can take a step back and say, well, yeah, they might violate these kinds of very demanding rationality requirements, but there are less demanding requirements that we can use instead, and then we can use other kinds of methods for identifying which option we should choose, and maybe then we can be inspired by statistical methods that's been used in physics, maybe, if I understand you correctly. And then is that something like that you're suggesting?
Yeah, similar. For instance, when you take the Thomas Nagel's example, there are only 3 choices, or 2 children or 3 children. It is really hard to make a decision when it comes to 3 or 2 children. But if it becomes a group of people or a society, and it is possible to apply some statistical methods to the group rather than individual.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Ishaq Hoja. I have a question, just like sort of intrigue. I mean, I I understand the philosophically interesting debates that revolves or you know in the different, let's say, views, baseline, etc., and the sufficient, prioritarianism, etc. I mean, that kind of problems I understand, in the sense of I see why we should address them. But my question is, at least based on the way we are thinking about them through, for example, the numbers, or putting it like this, right, in order to make the comparisons in a like intelligible and easy way, let's say, it seems that we are short-circuiting the most fundamental or a much more important area of contestation that we have, people have, which is basically putting the numbers in the first place, i.e., it seems to me that a lot of the controversy or the disagreement people will have is on whether a certain disease or certain case or child or whatever will get a 5 or a 7 or an 8. Before they even get to the point where now we've put the numbers and now we have the comparison. Of course, we can separate the problems, right? We can bracket out, say, okay, assume we have the rankings or the assignment of utilities or well-being or worse off, less off. But it seems that maybe in bioethics, for example, the difficult choices have to do more with, I don't know, like comparing the putting a number or evaluating, quantifying, let's say, quantifying a life with 1 kidney versus a life with 2 kidneys, but you feel that you are the cause of the death of your cousin because you didn't give the kidney. Right? Something, I mean, it seems that this is where a lot of people have the difficulties of making choices.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me, at least. Of course, now it's not only about individuals, it's society level. But yeah, I mean, just I'm wondering if the literature
I mean, I think you're largely right, but I think it depends a lot on the kinds of cases you're talking about. So here's a situation where I think the kind of worries that you raise are less obvious. So take again these numbers that I have here. Instead of letting them represent individuals and well-being, let's just say that there are 2 different diseases here. 5 is one illness, 7 is another illness. The numbers represent, on average, how well off someone who gets sick with that illness is, the first illness, and the 7 is, on average, how well off someone with the other illnesses. A and B represent different investment opportunities you can make in research and development on these illnesses. And this is the expected benefit, in expectation, how much better can we make it for people who get one illness or the other? So you remove yourself from all these personal issues. And, that's also a distributive ethical question, right? How should what's the best way of allocating scarce research and development funds in the pharmaceutical sector? I mean, we know in reality, pharmaceutical companies are not going to be driven by ethics. They're going to, they're going to spend their money on impotence drugs that have very small benefits. But yeah, you see my point.
Yeah.
And in those cases, I mean, there's still a lot of interesting questions, of course, about how to establish the numbers and so on. But in some cases, they are dealt with. Oh, there's a baby. In some cases, they are dealt with in very systematic ways. So especially in the health context, there's a lot to be said about this, but they're very well worked out, at least, methods for establishing the badness of certain illnesses. And the way they do this is through surveys, and there are different types of surveys, but for instance, they ask people how much they're willing to shorten their lives in order to avoid, being blind. And then, they make a bunch of questionnaires like this, and then based on the result, they can actually establish some numbers that they can then assign to certain health conditions. And so, yeah, there's a lot to be said about it, but at least, yeah, there's a systematic way of getting to the numbers, at least.
Yeah. I mean, it just maybe one, because unless people have questions, and I just have like one general remark about the whole kind of presentation. It's not about the substance, it's more about the, let's say, the logic of it or the methodology. I mean, it seems that, we started with certain views, well-held positions, varieties of opinions, and then we reached a situation which to me was like a kind of a turning point, where you said everyone, after Nagel's example, everyone agrees that the city choice is the best one, right? 10 and 11, this was the number.
Yeah.
And then you asked the question, you said, you are thinking about, or the rest of the presentation is how we reach this conclusion, right? And then we end it. So it's like, okay, so we agree on which is the best choice, city, move to the city. And now we are reflecting upon how do we reach this. And then we went through the different views: baseline view, binary, and global. And then we reached, what was the outcome there? The outcome there was what you called pessimistic, in the sense that these suggestions on how we have reached this that don't seem to work. They all have problems of requirements of rationality, right? So, what kind of conclusion, to the extent that the presentation is exhaustive, then it seems, that maybe what makes us choose city as the best option is not really based on, requirements of rationality. We reach decisions in different ways, or we have our intuitions, and yes, our intuitions don't satisfy the requirements of rush. Is this something like, is it going in this direction, or you think?
No.
Or no? Okay.
No, I think what I was rather suggesting, maybe I should have spelled it out. There's a much more straightforward way of reaching the conclusion that you should move to the city. And that's just to not talk about claims at all, and just say, for instance, I'm a utilitarian that cares about inequality. So I care about the total amount of benefit, but I insert some inequality aversion in it. And that will give you the same. But there's no talk about claims at all. It's just, I think that was rather what I was sort of trying to allude to, that the idea that what I wanted to be pessimistic about was, more than anything, how helpful it is to think in terms of individual claims.
Which is something that is very much present in a lot of the theories.
Yeah.
Okay, I see.
Yeah. Because there certainly are other ways of, getting. Yeah, there are other ways of reaching the same conclusion that just, to me, they seem simpler and more straightforward. But they might have other problems. A lot of people hate utilitarianism and think that a lot goes wrong with that. So there might be other issues with that.
Okay. Yes, Sinamoja?
Okay, thanks. Again, just about the global view, I was going to ask a question. Just to understand it better. In the global view, the better choice was picked out because of the presence of C. Correct?
Yes.
And so, practically speaking, then these other options, the presence of other options, the ones which ones are relevant? Is there like a kind of a theory to talk about these? Which options should be considered as relevant?
No, and that I think is what I was trying to point to as a big sort of problem with this idea or with this view, because if you think about it, when we sit like I do and think about how to rank different options, it's very common to do it in a very abstract way, where you start off just you fix a set of alternatives and then you play around with that. But in reality, there's the set of options that someone has in a choice situation is not going to be just given, right? It's gonna be very fluctuating. Maybe it's gonna depend on how you individuate options. Should I do A and have a cup of coffee, or do A and have a cup of tea? Yeah, in a sense, you might think that's the same option, but you could also think it's two different options, right? So there's an issue of how to individuate them. There's a different option, or there's a different issue about what to include. So in most choice situations that we face, we all have a whole range of options that are really, really bad, right? That we don't think, that we don't even describe, that we hardly even recognize, right? But they're still there. I can, instead of continue talking to you, I can just turn off my computer. That would be very rude, but it's still something I can do, right? So should I include these kinds of very strange options in my choice set? The global view doesn't say very much about that. And partly, I think, because it's been developed by choice theoreticians that don't really pay much attention to these kinds of issues, in my experience. But for it to be, to your point, I think, for the view to be plausible, it has to give you an answer to this question of what to include, right? I think that's right. And how it's going to do that is not something I can answer. And I think it's going to be very difficult for them. So I was thinking, I was playing around at some point with the idea that, okay, so maybe we can have some kind of Pareto criteria. So options that are Pareto dominated should not be part of what we take into consideration, because I mean, you can have those kinds of ideas, right? But when I was thinking about it, I think actually that's a much too weak kind of criteria. I mean, you can come up with situations where you don't have, I mean, in this case that I have here, you do have, I mean, C is Pareto dominated by both A and B, right? But you can come up with cases where you don't have this, and it's still going to seem like a very, very bad option.
Okay.
So I don't think that's sufficient.
Yeah, and so
I think
Sinem hocam, you have a connection problem, I think.
yeah.
Okay. Okay. So, well, I think that she had a connection problem, and also Kerim Hoca had to leave.
Yeah.
I think we don't have any further question. Esra hocam and İshak hocam, do you have any further question? I don't also. Thank you, Anderson. Thank you for this presentation. Maybe in another talk, maybe face to face at Marmara University.
I hope so.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.